Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin the third of the spotlights on the Chapter 22 review, which is being led by the Council of Yukon First Nations and facilitated by Gunta Business. Today, in the third of these spotlights, the conversation will be focused on business partnerships, public and private partnerships, First Nation, non-First Nation partnerships. And to participate in that conversation, we have some of the leaders of those partnerships, contracts, relationships. And we want to talk today about how do they build those relationships, what kind of businesses they're involved in, what are success stories, things that went well, but also to have a frank conversation about things that didn't work so well and why they didn't work so well, not as a way of acts of recrimination or reflections on failures of Chapter 22, but more as useful object lessons for other potential partners, particularly other sectors of the Yukon economy where these partnerships have not yet emerged or become fruitful. So I'm going to ask each of the participants in this conversation to go, starting with Yanni, to go around the table, introduce themselves and their role, and then we will get into the conversation. We have one participant, Peter, who I will save you the best for last, Peter, to introduce yourself and your role with Chief Isaac, okay? So Yanni, you have the floor.
Right, so I am Yanni Jokic, and I am the CEO of the Na-Cho Nyäk Development Corporation, which is one of the economic arms for the First Nation of Na-Cho Nyäk.
Wendy.
Wendy Taylor. I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Alkan Air, which is an aviation company primarily based in Whitehorse, but with a base in Nanaimo, BC, and Whitehorse, Yukon.
Albert.
Good afternoon. My name is Albert Drapeau, Executive Director for Yukon First Nation Chamber of Commerce.
Peter.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for those of you joining us today, both here and virtually. I'm Peter Turner. I'm the Economic Development Analyst at CYFN. Thank you very much.
Melissa, just for the record, are you here?
I'm here. I don't know if it'll be on camera. I'm Melissa Murray, and I'm the Project Manager for Yukon First Nation Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Purley. I'm the new CEO at Chief Isaac Group in Dawson. And so a newcomer to the Yukon and dealing with Indigenous companies and very interested in forging new and extensible partnerships.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to, in the first hour, focus in the main on the relationships that have been built between Na-Cho Nyäk Development Corporation and Wendy Taylor's company, Alkan Air. And so maybe I could start with Wendy, because you are the principal and the major partner in these relationships. Talk about your experience. Where did the idea come from? How did you put it into practice? How long did it take? How difficult it was? And then we could actually go back to Yanni to talk about the First Nation perspective on the same relationships.
Sure. So thanks, Tony. I kind of got to go all the way back to 2012, because in 2012 at Alkan, we started having conversations about, okay, what can we do to develop partnerships in Yukon, and particularly looking at the First Nations and their development corporations. So started conversations back in 2012. Early on, spoke to a couple of different development corporations about how can we get all the development corporations involved in a leasing company to support aviation. So this idea is a long time coming. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get everyone to the table in 2012, but within a couple of years, thanks to Lynn Hutton, Peter, at Chief Isaac, our initial relationship was actually Chief Isaac, Na-Cho Nyäk and Kluane First Nations acquired an aircraft, a Navajo chieftain, and leased it to Alkan. And we did that for a couple of years. and then we transitioned, and Kluane First Nation and Na-Cho Nyäk Dun acquired a Cessna Caravan, which is an aircraft that's used around the territory in all traditional areas, traditional territory areas in the territory. Exploration and mining, a little bit of charter for different companies, and works primarily in Mayo, Yukon. And we got into that, I guess that was, I'm not sure when we bought the Caravan. I'm looking at Yanni here to see if she remembers.
I believe it was 2017.
Okay, 2017. So we transitioned from the Navajo Chieftain, which the three Dev Corps were owners in, to the Navajo Chieftain. And then I guess it was in the fall of 2019, I actually started dealing with Ben Asquith with Dada Guy, talking about an opportunity to get into aircraft for the aerial firefighting. And that conversation is ongoing. We'll talk about that more later, hopefully. But at the same time, chatted with Yanni about, okay, so what do we need to do here to get a First Nation leasing company off the ground in a way that makes sense with initially whatever Dev Corp we can get to the table to start with, but so that we can involve other parties later. Yanni and I started working on that January,
Specifically for the medevac opportunity in Yukon First Nations air leasing, I think
Yeah.
January-ish.
So in January-ish, we started talking about how to get the First Nation leasing company off the ground, and in that conversation, we had Selkirk Development Corp, Carcross Tagish First Nation, and Kluane First Nation and Na-Cho Nyäk Dun. But truly, Yanni and I have been the ones, working studiously on this project since January. I have to say, Terry Hayden, before retiring, and then Stephen Mooney in his role also played a significant role in the early months of 2022. And yeah, I'm excited to say that I guess late June, we were at a stage where we had a First Nation leasing company set up, had those four partners in on the leasing company, and they own two air ambulance aircraft, King Air 350s, that are leased back to Alkan Air, who has the 3-year medevac contract with the government of Yukon. So that's that relationship.
So before I go to Yanni, let me ask you a little bit, Wendy, if you could explain to those of us who are not in your world why it made sense for you as the entrepreneur to have First Nations purchasing planes and then leasing them to you. What was the genius behind that business model?
Yeah, so in aviation, it's very common to have a leasing company and an operating company. So the leasing company, it's actually it's a significant capital investment, but it's a very low risk, stable return. So there's always some organization or some bank involved in the leasing portion of any operating aircraft company. So for Alkan, and back in 2012, we were really looking at, okay, we do want to grow. We know we want to go there in the future. Who do we want as our partners? And for us, to be honest, Tony, it really came back to what we do. We fly in every single traditional territory in Yukon, whether that be for exploration and mining, whether that be to fly canoeists in and out of the Peel, or of course, most of you know we do the air ambulance work in the territory. So when we were looking for partnerships, it just made sense that our partners were our clients, right? So that's where that initial conversation came from. But then, it's 2022 today, and I'm delighted that we can finally talk about having a First Nation leasing company that does own those medevac aircraft. But really, that's where it comes from, is having a partner right here at home.
Okay. So Yanni, could you help us with the same history, but from a First Nation perspective?
For sure. Yeah, so we, as Wendy said, we're one of the original parties when we started in aviation leasing with Alkan. And over time, our investment moved into co-ownership with Kluane Na-Cho Limited Partnership. So we have Tashone Air Leasing, which is an entity that currently now holds the Grand Caravan that we lease to Alkan Air. That's the FTTL. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I got the the registration number proper. And that's based primarily in Mayo. And Wendy brought up the medevac opportunity, and our partners at Kluane Na-Cho, we knew that while we already figured out a model for air leasing, Tashone Air Leasing existed, it's doing well, we knew it wasn't the right entity to move forward. And we really wanted to expand the partnership in a way that made sense to bring all dev corps and all those dev corps that want to be at the table to have an opportunity to participate, not just in specific aviation investments, but to participate in the aviation sector as a whole and across the Yukon territory as a whole. So I also want to say, I feel like we do have to get the clip from Wendy saying, wanting to do business with your clients. That's just what makes sense. I do really want to send that around to the other banks because I feel that when we were trying to figure out this, the structuring of this current investment for the medevac planes and shopping it around and trying to get financing, I was laughed out of the room by most of the banks. And most of the banks could not understand why Alkan would be doing this. And it just did not make sense to them and they couldn't wrap their heads around it. And if it weren't for some of our financing partners that are here on the ground in the Yukon and seeing what is going on and, the agenda that's being pushed forward and the barriers that are being broken down, I don't know if we would have gotten that financing. And so I kudos to Wendy for breaking down barriers and setting the stage for.
Okay, I want to come back to that banking point later because
right.
When Rich Thompson, an MBD, joins the conversation later, we have had a discussion with them at about a time when the banks would not finance anything here unless it was like a gold mine and you already had the gold. Yeah. And I think about the American experience and community where cultural minorities in any place in the United States where they are banking customers would have levered the fact that they were customers into forcing the bank to hire their people and train their people and actually become part of the enterprise. We don't see much of that with Canadian banks. And maybe they're too big and they're too Toronto-based and just don't know any reality. I mean, I remember in my own constituency, they wouldn't give mortgages in the rural country residential acreages, plots to build houses because there were existing mineral claims on the property that hadn't been used for 50 years, but for as far as the bank was concerned, you didn't have free and clear title to the surface rights. So, this is an old problem here that I'd like to I'll come back to maybe with Peter and Rich. But let me come back to a different question, Yanni, which I think is important. The Na-Cho Nyäk done, I don't think your relationship with Wendy was the first business relationship you had.
No.
And so I'd like to talk to you about the early experience with the Development Corporation there. What ventures did you look at or try, or maybe, if you can be frank, not succeed with, and why this became a good thing to do and worked for both of you?
Yeah. So I would say my career in the development corporations has been a short one in the grand scheme of things. So only with NNDDC for the past 6 years. And in that time with NNDDC, I do actually think the investment with Alkan was our first big investment at the time in which we were rebuilding the corporation. So I didn't have much exposure to other, tangible capital investments that I got to play an active part in setting up and managing. But I will say that regardless of us not having had many capital opportunities at that point, we definitely had a lot of different people knocking on our doors, especially because of the mining activity that is in the traditional territory, so specifically around Victoria Gold and Alexco's projects. And while those weren't necessarily direct capital investments that were being asked of us for those business opportunities, there were still people knocking on our doors to ask for business opportunities. And I would say the thing that stood out with Alkan and why we chose to do business with Alkan was very much that Wendy brought an opportunity to the table that was fair, was founded in respect, was equal. There was transparency throughout the whole entire negotiation process. And everything I think that we asked and wanted clarity on, Wendy always had numbers behind. Wendy had a rationale for. Wendy opened up the documentation and we were able to have those open and transparent conversations. And so I think that's a key thing, is that these opportunities have to be founded in relationship and have to be founded in trust and transparency. And that at that specific moment in time was something that made Alkan stand out compared to to the rest. I have seen a shift happening, that it is happening more and more, which I'm excited about and happy for. So that was one huge thing. And then I'd say also the risk factor. The way in which Wendy structured that opportunity that came forward and all the opportunities since then, compared to other capital endeavors that I've, looked through our books to get a historical snapshot of the corporation, was that it never, I won't say never, but oftentimes it did not seem that the partners coming to the table were wanting to de-risk the opportunity for us to come to the table and participate. It almost felt as if risk was being downloaded on the development corporation as a quote unquote partner. And that's something that Wendy has greatly strayed away from. And we're appreciative for that, because while we want to expand our business experience and overall management in this sector, we have to understand that we don't know everything about repairing planes, and we don't know everything about, NavCan and all the regulations and the safety parameters. And we're only going to get the chance to move in that direction if we can have a sustainable and stable investment to help us get there, as opposed to pulling the rug out from under us 1 month in because there was a whole bunch of risk exposure we weren't anticipating.
Right. So let me. I want to come back to both of you to talk more about the social impact in the communities first. But can I go to you, Wendy, first in terms of the employment and training opportunities that these partnerships accelerated or triggered, if I can put it that way.
It's interesting, yeah. So there's two significant pieces, I think, from a reconciliation and from moving the Yukon forward perspective, and that one is economic, and that's really the relationships with the DevCorps that Yanni and I have, which is great. But the other one's a social piece, right? So what are we doing to ensure that in addition to economic reconciliation, we're really talking about how do we ensure that future generations in the communities actually have opportunities, right? So for sure, opportunities potentially in management in like NBD or something, but from Alkan's perspective, we look at it and go, okay, the one thing that we can really look to offer to future generations of Yukoners is flying, being a pilot. So we have a flight school, and we founded that back in 2014. And this relationship is just one more way, from our perspective, to put a logo onto an aircraft and really talk to kids in different schools across the Yukon about, look at these medevac planes that come in and out of our community and save lives. We're part of that. And as soon as we do that, we create a situation where a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, they all of a sudden see that it is attainable, that aviation isn't this thing that happens way over there. They actually see that it's something that is possible. So for me, the social piece is significant. I want to make sure that Northerners are flying in the north, taking care of Yukoners. But in order to do that, we need to figure out, okay, what do we need to do within each territory to make sure those kids understand that they can be part of this industry. So although the flight school isn't actually in partnership with the development corporations, because it's the social piece instead of the economic piece, I do believe the two things go hand in hand. And it does give us an opportunity to get out in the communities and have conversations, whether that be with the kids themselves or with their principals, and talk about, we have these relationships with the DevCorps where we want to bring our flight school out and give future generations opportunities to take the flight school training right at home. So.
I mean, this is a really important point, because I remember as a young person, you may be astonished that I was actually a young person at one point, that if you were a young person, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in small Yukon communities 50 years ago, you looked at the employment landscape and you could be a heavy equipment operator or a waitress.
Exactly.
And those were the opportunities. Unless you had enough education, or parents who would force you to get enough education to have your eyes opened up to other possibilities. I'm going to come back to both of you in a second, but I want to ask Albert to come in here, because in a discussion we had earlier, Albert, you talked about the very early attempts to set the development corporations to sit at the same table. And I may not be remembering this accurately, that out of that, I don't know if it was the development corporations or the First Nation governments themselves, but the First Nation Fire operation emerged. Could you talk about that a little bit as an early opportunity?
Yeah, and well, back in the early 2000s, I think it was 2001, the First Nation Development Corporations had come together. We each had a separate agreement with the federal government to provide fire suppression services. And it felt as though the contracts were pitting each other against each other, or pitting us against each other. And so we had come together after the first year, and it was time to renegotiate the contract. And it was led by Ruth Massey. She brought us all together, and
Who happened to be not only a chief, but an entrepreneur.
an entrepreneur,
And, also led the firefighting.
and
for
she
a
did.
while. Yeah.
She did lead the firefighting, and she was part of, I guess at that time it was Mundessa Development Corp, and she brought us together, and she said, we need to work together. We need to show a unified voice. We need to be sharing resources. And at that time, we agreed, but it didn't carry on. Like, it kind of just died at the table. And I feel that development corporations were fairly new, young, and they weren't ready yet.
One of the readiness questions that somebody has mentioned to us, it may have been someone in NBD, and I will mention that Rich Thompson has just joined the conversation, having got off the plane. You must have persuaded them to land early. So
They,
actually-
you know, you always worry about them being late, and they were early today.
There we go. One of the complications was that many of the dev corps initially didn't have people with Bachelor of Commerce degrees or business experience, but were actually land claims negotiators, which is a wonderful thing. I mean, land claims negotiators should be our heroes, but that didn't actually equip them for running development corporations or, in some cases, any business of any kind. And there was a transition period, it seems to me, when the development corporations moved away from that talent pool to, in fact, bringing people onto their boards who
had the skills and the business mindset. And that, I think, was a significant move or a shift. In the beginning, it wasn't clear what the role of a development corp was for. Was it for wealth generation? Was it for community development? Was it for employment? Was it for investment? And the mandate that would come back would be, well, we want you to do all of it. We want you to be all of it. But when you go to ask the First Nation government, they were like, well, you're in charge of economic development. Well, what does that look like for you guys? Well, like, what do you want to see? Well, we want all these four things.
Yeah.
And it was difficult to get the momentum. And then there was a shift where I'm going to use NNDDC because that was my experience.
Albert used to run it.
Where they looked at their citizenship and they picked out business-minded people to sit on their board. And that was the beginning of the shift from the negotiators, from the politicians, because we had a chief or a counselor sitting on the board, but they had to keep their council hat separate, and it was difficult for those people. So the shift helped look at the negotiations of, I'm going to say, joint venture agreements, the 5% revenue sharing agreements, And like Yanni said about the banks, how do you gain access to capital when you have no assets?
We're going to come back to Rich Thompson about that
Yeah.
later.
So we were financially constrained. So we had to look at ways to generate enough revenue so that we could invest. Or I think one of the biggest purchase at that time for the Development Corp was the store. And how do we move forward with that purchase? And I know that some of the challenges there was finding staff and having the increased costs that weren't with the previous owners because they worked hard and they didn't collect a wage. So there were challenges there.
Classic problem of the mom and pop working 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come back to that question with Rich, if I can, when we go back to more with MBD focus. But I want to return to the question of the social impacts, because
Yeah.
one of the lessons, it seems to me, of all of the more prosperous First Nations everywhere in Western Canada is that they learned that it was a fatal mistake to have politicians, no matter how intelligent they may be, to be making economic decisions or running business decisions. And you needed this clean separation between economic decisions or business management and the political decisions. And that took a while to, I think, to bake into the kind of thinking in the First Nation world. So I want to come back. Wendy talked about social impacts, employment, training, some of those things. Can we go back to that from after Albert's time,
Yeah.
to Na-Cho and that social impact question that you raised earlier, both of you raised earlier?
Yeah, for sure. So Wendy was talking about, there's the social side and the economic side. At NNDDC in our team, we tend to take the approach where the two are not separate. I'm not saying that Wendy was implying that at all, but I think oftentimes people put them in separate boxes. Yeah. And we do really believe that you can make good money from good things for good reasons. And that is why, Julia's on the call, but we set up a position for a chief reinvestment officer, because it's how do we take the return?
A chief
reinvestment officer. Okay. So it's how do we take the returns that we're making as an entity, and sometimes you reinvest those into other high earning endeavors, but you also have to reinvest back into people, place, culture, community, language, and how do we make that happen? And I think a big piece, you talk about that separation between politics and business. And I think for a while why there was not that separation was because people needed to see themselves in their businesses, in their nation's business. And that separation happened. And I think now DevCores are kind of coming back to the place of, now how do we bring in the social aspect? Because people need to see themselves in these businesses and in these futures. And I think, through these strategic partnerships, that's one way in which we can make it happen. So I think of something that I've been working on with NND's education manager and thinking about the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate booklet. And there's a page in the booklet, and I'll refer to it as Pathways to Success. So it says, if you want to be X, Y, and Z, these are the pathways that you need to choose in school. So you can choose your science stream, your math stream, your art stream, whatever it is. But they seem like they're such high-level abstract opportunities. And what I would really love to do is now take the investments that NNDDC has and the businesses that NNDDC has and almost model out what pathways to success look like that and bring it to a much more personal level. So it's not just a kid is saying, well, I want to be a pilot, and that's something super abstract, and this is the path to get there. It's, no, I want to be a pilot flying my nation's plane. And then there's the personal relationship that's in there. You know who to call, who to reach out to. And then suddenly those opportunities are no longer a far dream for a 17-year-old who might be living in a small community, doesn't have many connections outside of the community, might be struggling with confidence issues, whatever it may be, suddenly this becomes a reality. And it's on a human level that you can start to create those pathways. But in order to make them realistic opportunities, you need to still have that business side of it. So there needs to be, let's say with the pilot, a plane they can fly at the end of the day. And so trying to tackle both of those different sides and doing it through a staged approach, because I believe building up moderately.
I want to go back to Wendy on this, but before, can we just, because you hinted at this, I want to just take a moment to talk about defining success in that picture, because from a simple business point of view, you've got a bottom line. You've
Correct.
got your annual report, your audited thing, your tax return. But in the community dimension, having people who have jobs and homes and good health is also something you cannot live in a community and be unaware of, right?
Correct.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Ooh, defining success. I feel like it's an ongoing endeavor, something NNDDC is trying to tackle head on. And I see that Saidi Deska Gauthier is on the call as well. So she's doing work for NND around regional economic diversification and looking at successes and failures within Chapter 22. And she, has gone through decades of documentation of what have citizens been saying around economic development and what success looks like, and has developed a whole kind of matrix that we're hoping to be able to use as a starting point. And we don't have it figured out yet. And I don't think that at one point in time, when you do say, okay, this is what success looks like, that's what success is always going to look like. And so we're trying to figure out a way in which we can continuously keep those channels of communication open and the feedback loops open, because success will continue to evolve. And how do we navigate that? So I don't have the answer for what success looks like, because we're currently in the process, but at least I know from the way in which I try to run the organization that it is the triple bottom line, and that people come first at the end of the day.
So we may not do this now, but I want to put on the table a question that seems to me, which is very important in the Yukon, which is we haven't for a long time had an adult discussion about what success means in terms of our relationship with the mining industry for a long time. What is gold selling? $1,700 an ounce now. We still have a royalty of 26 cents an ounce, which seems to me
Archaic?
fanciful. Yes. We have a mining company might well, if the Canadian tax regime still allowed, as it did once, a tax-free period of several years, which allowed them to high grade and then get in and get out very quickly. That's not a reality anymore. But even now in Scandinavia, where you've spent some time, they will actually argue that having a mine that is a 50-year mine is much better than having a 5-year mine. Not only in terms of helping build community, but also giving opportunities to train and give people careers
Correct.
that last a long time. And Tony Hodge, someone with a PhD in mining engineer from UBC, but a long-time Yukoner, has argued the single instrument for achieving that is actually to have governments encourage mining companies to build smaller mills rather than the big mills. Since most of the capital in a mine goes into the mill, if you build a smaller mill that encourages them to actually mine for a long period, you are more likely to get jobs in Mayo and keep them in Mayo, and actually encourage the company to train people from Mayo in Mayo.
And I'm happy you made that distinction, because you referenced jobs earlier, and I wanted to note that I really think we need to shift the thinking from jobs to careers.
Okay.
It's interesting because you bring up mining, and I think oftentimes when we think about the opportunities related to mining, they're site-specific. And it's not looking at all the other opportunities that come with that industry, and even within those companies that are operating the projects, right? There's no reason why, when we're negotiating impact benefit agreements or CBAs and talking about all the opportunities, why that has to be limited to the site. There's no reason why we can't talk about someone becoming the chief financial officer for this entity. There's no reason why we can't talk about sitting on the board of directors. There's no reason why we can't talk about them being mining engineers. And I think that we have to, like, as a society, make a conscious shift towards talking about careers and not talking about jobs. Because oftentimes what I see is that the conversation starts at jobs. And I'm like, but that should just be a given that we already know. Like, why are we starting the conversation at that level? And we need to be talking about longer term, higher value opportunities.
So I'm going to come back to Wendy in a moment, but I want to just mention, because Rich, you weren't part of this conversation, but some years ago, a senior person whose name was from MBD asked me if I could find a First Nation chartered accountant. And I did find a Casca First Nation chartered accountant. Unfortunately, he was living and married in London, England, and really didn't want to go back to Whitehorse.
Understandable.
But it was interesting. There were such people out there,
Yep.
and they had found careers, but they weren't finding them here, which I think is an important point. So, Wendy, what do you see in terms of careers for pilots, mechanics, and so forth?
Well, yeah, as Yanni pointed out, I mean, for sure, pilots are the first place we go to because we have a flight school and we have the ability to literally take people from the communities and from Whitehorse right out of high school, get them through the flight school and get them in the flight line at Alkan or Air North, to be honest. Joe and I have had some conversations about what are we going to do to ensure that going forward we have Yukon pilots flying in the north. So you talked about the bottom line in a business just being the bottom line, and that's true. However, when you look at our industry, we're looking for pilots that want to live in the Yukon for a long time. And so quite selfishly, we're interested in training people who were born and raised in the Yukon because we know they're going to stay here. We have parties when people get married or to a Yukoner or buy a house, right? I mean, we're looking for people that want to be here for a long time. And honestly, for all of us, that's the best thing. If we can have a Yukon pilot that stays for a long time, their understanding of the terrain and their familiarity with being in the north will be huge. So whether it's Yukon, NWT, or none of it, being able to actually train Northerners to fly in the north is key. But when you look at the company, yeah, I'd love to have a First Nation CFO. I'm in the midst of hiring one right now. That's a great example. We have the flight school to train, but even on the AME side, there's a massive shortage of aviation mechanics worldwide. And there is the ability, just like you can do for air vehicle mechanics, to go through, the prairies. You go through these programs where you do an apprenticeship back and forth, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities. It's really about getting out to the schools and having those conversations and figuring out now how do we ensure that the kids in grades 10 through 12 know these opportunities are there and what needs to happen, to your point about what stream you go through in school to ensure you come out of grade 12 in a way to do it. But I would say both Alkan and Air North are very, very keen to employ the Yukoners.
Well, we are making some progress. I was recently, for the first time in my life, on an Air North flight, but where both the pilot and the co-pilot were young women. That would not have been the reality when I was first starting to fly.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And we do have a handful of Yukon born and raised pilots at Alkan today. I'd love to be at a point where I could say, 50% were born and raised Yukoners. And yeah, we're looking at some exciting new other opportunities. And I don't know, can I just jump in and tell you about something? So the First Nation, can I do this, Yanni? Can I be the one to? Okay.
You can be the one to yell it from the rooftops.
Mentioned this back in September 2019. I started talking to Ben with Dadagay, and I talked to him because he's involved in wildland fire. And we started having conversations about what do we need to do to get to a point where we have a First Nations leasing group that can work with Alkan in a partnership basis to go after the aerial firefighting requirements for Yukon. So that tender is out as we speak. There is a First Nation leasing company, so exciting opportunity. We've not won a tender. We have to still do that. But the partnership is there, and I know that that the First Nations group is excited about working with us, trying to put out a really competitive bid. And when we talk about the future of First Nations community members, in aviation, aerial firefighting is actually the pinnacle. I know some people in the room were there for the breakfast back in January where I shared cool pictures of aerial firefighting. But really, aerial firefighting is actually the pinnacle of a pilot's career. So it happens after 10 years of being a pilot. The idea would be get out there, get this aerial firefighting contract, and our desire is to get a kid out of grade 12, let's just use an example, kid out of grade 12, that born and raised in Pelly Crossing, comes in, gets their flight school training, starts flying with Alkan Air on the air medevac side, eventually goes into charter, potentially goes into flying float planes in Mayo, and then it does take 10 years to get there, but eventually, and 10 years into their career, be out there saving their community. So, I mean, that's really the ultimate goal. And so it's exciting to say we kind of have that out there right now. The other big opportunity we have is Alkan is bidding on the BC medevac contract. And there's an opportunity to have up to 3 of the new aircraft that are required for the BC contract owned by the First Nation leasing company. So yeah, there's plenty of additional opportunities. As Yanni mentioned, we're looking at putting opportunity on top of opportunity here.
Before I go back to Yanni, let me ask you, what would it take? You talked about the 50% local hire goal.
Yeah, yes.
What would it take to get there?
Well, I think it'll take what we're actually looking at doing, which is getting out there into the high schools. And I mean, signing kids up right in grade 12, put your name on the dotted line. I mean, that's what it's going to take. I think we're going to have to go out there and handpick these young people and put them to the school. We've had a lot of tours at the flight school. We've been out to the communities. We're actually in a process right now of going through a decision-making process to get out to 2 of the communities in the next couple of years and actually train kids right in their communities. Because I've always said we want to train people to fly planes in the north, and we want people to be able to learn how to fly at home. Well, if you're from Pelly Crossing, Whitehorse isn't home, right? So have to figure out, okay, how do we actually get out to Watson Lake, to Mayo, to Dawson, to Pelly Crossing, and actually go through the process of allowing these kids to learn how to fly a plane right in their true backyard.
And I think it starts earlier than that. I know that there's, the grade 12 thing, you can graduate, start your career and everything like that. But I think what Alkan's trying to do and what we've seen work in communities is working with the community champions that are there and have a connection with the youth and grade 12 oftentimes is too late. And how can we work with the kids earlier on in their education to light their fire, to tap into the passions that they have, to celebrate the skills that they have? I think of the skateboard program that we're running in Mayo, and I never thought that a skateboard program would lead to me, connecting with a 15-year-old and identifying that kid's gonna be the next oil burner mechanic, or he is, creating these Frankenstein snowmobiles and making them work and taking all these different parts, and he's a genius. When we started with skateboards, but here we are working with a kid and celebrating the skill sets that he has and being like, these are the opportunities and these are the connections that we have. Are any of these of interest to you? Yes? No? All right, let's make it happen. And so I know Wendy's working with a few folks that have been doing quite a lot even in those earlier years of education at the schools, and I think that's going to be key.
So let me pick up on this education economy link. And forgive me for asking a long-winded question, but I was in a northern Norwegian community on a fjord, which ironically, in terms of sustainability, because they invented it, was next door to an apple orchard and a fish farm, which wouldn't be allowed in BC, for example. But what was remarkable about this plant, which was 100 years old, battery plant, every single employee I met in the plant had been born in the community.
Wow.
And a large number of the employees in the plant were wearing lab coats, which absolutely fascinated me. I mean, I'm a former miner. I've been into mills where you never saw anybody in a lab coat. Everybody was wearing hard hats and overalls and, basically, from our point of view, doing grunt work. And I asked what they were doing in these lab coats. They said, well, we're constantly looking at innovations in our own mill, improving technical innovations. And I said, well, you seem to be spending a lot of money doing this. Why are you doing this? Because, in fact, 10% of our profits come from these innovations. We market them around the world. In fact, this relatively young man who was at lab tech said, I've been to 15 countries selling our stuff. Now, I never saw that in our mind. Everything was replacement, maintenance, mine it, get in, get out. But the other thing they told me, I said, well, how did you end up in this career? Because they were engineers and lab techs and other things. They said, when I was in junior high, just to get to your point, some teacher told the company that I had this talent, and the company came to me and said, if you're willing to train in this field, we will pay you all the way to go through university on a condition that you come back here and work in this plant. And that's a relationship I've never seen in Northern Canadian mining communities for the most part. And it is a cultural shift, obviously, that happened a long time ago in Nordic countries, but hasn't happened here because we sort of have this fly-in, fly-out, transient worker kind of tradition, which we may need to get past. Do you want to add anything to that, Wendy? Or?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And Yanni brings up a point. I always talk about the 5-year-old. So I'm glad Yanni brought up the younger generation. Because really, at the end of the day, if we want to have future generations of Yukon kids flying our airplanes, we need to talk to them when they're 5. And we need to get out to their communities with the air ambulance planes, with the First Nations logo on it, so they can really see that this is something they can be a part of. And, we get out there with Yukon Women in Mining, and we get our planes out there and get, 10, 12, 14-year-olds into the planes and get them to do a bit of a tour in them. But now the next step is really to get out there and have the kids in grade 5 or grade 1 and grade 2 get out, have a tour of the plane and really understand. And it's not just pilots, it's the pilots and the medics, right? Like if we could get to a point where, I've always say for the North, in the North, by the North. So if we can get to a point where we're truly taking care of our own communities with our own community people, whether that be as a CFO, as a pilot, as a paramedic, that's when the Yukon can truly say that, that we're a bit autonomous, right?
Albert's nodding vigorously. Do you want to actually get into this conversation?
I totally agree with what is being said. I feel that if, looking back at myself, if I had known the opportunities at a younger age, I feel that my career path would have been totally different. I remember I wanted to be an archaeologist, and my mom had said, there's no jobs in that, so you need to find something else. And I'm like, what am I, like, I don't know what to do. And this was grade 7, grade 8. And I thought, well, I'm okay at math. I can read. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I guess I can do business, but not business as an entrepreneur. I was brought up with the mentality that you have to work for someone. And so I was thankful that Meg and Dick Wallingham took me under their wing, showed me the hotel industry, and I was like, oh, someday I would love to do this. So I would love to.
You're sitting next to a man who can make
I-
it happen.
I
Albert,
know.
don't we have jobs for you?
I would love to run a hotel. And then in 1987, my dreams were dashed when the hotel burnt down, and I was like, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I tried housekeeping. I tried librarian. I had to babysit, just a number of part-time jobs just to make ends meet. And I went out to a placer mine and became a bull cook for a season. And I was like, after the season, I was like, I don't want to be working like this 16-hour days. And so I went to Yukon College at the time and got my accounting clerk certificate, and then obtained a position with the Village of Mayo as clerk treasurer, and was there for 7 years. And so that is basically how I started my public service career. And I just think that the seed needs to be planted at an early stage. And like Wendy said, 5, 6-year-old, my son, who is 6, was like, I want to be an airplane pilot. I want to be a police officer. And I think that's about it. Or maybe even a paleontologist because he likes dinosaurs. But he already has 3 things that he wants to do.
So I want to come back to Wendy and Yanni to see if you want to add anything or elaborate on anything you've said earlier, because in a few minutes I'm going to shift the conversation more towards MVDs and hotels and land development and so forth. But take the time if you want it. Yeah.
Do you have any final comments?
Well, I think one thing we haven't had the chance to talk in depth about yet, but I know it's a common theme, in our prep, and it's a common theme that I think Peter's going to speak to later as well, but just the mentality of working together and economies of scale. And that coupled with, I will say, like the approach Wendy's taken is not just single opportunities and creating access to an industry or creating access to a sector. And while you'll have many opportunities within that, that's how you create sustainable businesses. And with Yukon First Nations air leasing, we're hoping that, as many development corporations as possible can be part of this together. And yeah, just trying to break down the barriers for us to work together in a sustainable fashion and in long-term opportunities.
So let me, Wendy and Yanni, this is a question last one I'll put to you, if you take your time and answer it. You've talked about what has recently worked well in terms of the forging of these partnerships and relationships. What in the years in which you've been working on these challenges has not worked so well? And you mentioned the banking challenge, but which I understand we will come back to in many ways. But what else has not worked so well, has been a disappointment for you or difficulty for you?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think it's important because part of course, these conversations is to help other private sector businesses in the Yukon figure out how to engage with the First Nations and the DevCorp. So I'll share a bit of my story. So I did start talking to my business partners back in 2012. And in the early days, I reached out to a couple of CEOs and DevCorps, and I won't get into which ones because it doesn't matter. But at that point, I'd already determined that I wanted to work with as many DevCorps as possible, which of course is where we are today, in getting to an air leasing company where they own the air ambulance planes. However, back then, there wasn't a First Nation Chamber of Commerce, there wasn't an Albert to call, and I was not able to move the needle. So I genuinely had an interest to move this forward, but there was really nobody for me to talk to that could help me figure out who I should be talking to and how to have those conversations in the most beneficial way. And I have to say, Peter, prior to you, when Lynn Hutton was there, it was honestly, Lynn Hutton was the first person before I worked with Kluwani First Nation, which was Terry at the time, and then Na-Cho done. It might have been Greg when was he there when we did the Navajo?
Yes.
Okay, so Greg and Terry were involved, but Lynn is the one that really worked the hardest with me early on. But that was my challenge early on, was trying to figure out who was going to work with me on a DevCorp, from a DevCorp perspective, to move the concept forward. And I would say hopefully the Chamber of Commerce will be able to do that going forward. So hopefully Albert and Melissa can help you with that. And then the second piece is really me more than my partners. So because I run a private business and things change every single day in the private sector, right? So the needle's constantly changing. I was having conversations probably at a more detailed level than I should have been. So as a result, if you read a financial statement for a private sector business, things change day to day. So I was probably looking at it at a sort of a too fine of a detailed perspective. So I'd suggest people go into that conversation with a very clear understanding of this is the opportunity at a very high level, and figure out ways to partner that are going to provide the DevCorp with a stable, low-risk return, if you can do that. So this is where the leasing company has been a great opportunity for us. And then also start having conversations about, in addition to the economic perspective, what is the social aspect? And I know the DevCorp isn't necessarily, in all cases, going to be engaged on the social piece, because some First Nations, they have a DevCorp that is very focused on the economic piece, and they have the First Nation or even a community DevCorp focused on the community. But it's important to understand as a private sector business, I think, what is the economic opportunity? How can you provide that in a stable, low-risk return environment? And at the same time, what is the social element? So, what can you bring to the table, or what kind of conversation can you have about ensuring future generations have opportunities for careers right here in the territory? So those are sort of my, if I was sitting down with someone one-on-one that was in the private sector, those are the things I would share.
So, Yanni, do you have anything to add on that?
I'd say maybe just going back to, I think it was the first point I made in this session, which is just around bringing worthwhile opportunities forward. Opportunities that are founded in transparency, trust, well, I don't want to say equal participation, but fair participation. And yeah, not just trying to set up an opportunity where you're downloading the risk on your quote unquote partner. And so, as I had noted, that is something that really made Alkan stand out amongst the rest.
There are, I assume, some cultural challenges, though. When I worked in the mines, there were a few, Albert, we remember the days at Clinton Creek, there were a few Han citizens who would, or Wet'suwet'en citizens who would actually work at the mine. But the mine would complain they couldn't keep them as employees, but one of the most basic problems was they had shift work, which people who have families and communities and were living in, say, Dawson City in that case, found that profoundly unsettling. And it wasn't an absolute necessity that the mine had to operate that way, but it did because that was the industrial model. I'm guessing that if we're actually there are going to be some kind of conventions of business operations nowadays that may have to change to bridge the gap with cultures that have different values and norms about living and working.
Well, and I think we'll also see the seasonal component. So let's say about aerial firefighting, when most of that work goes on, does also tend to be around, the summer in the Yukon. And so people are hunting, fishing, gathering.
Having fun.
Yeah. And so I think that is something that we're going to have to take into consideration as we do that capacity development piece, because those are realities and dynamics of the communities and of the territory. So that's for Wendy to figure out with Tosh, Lacia, and the team. But it is also something that we've found with our other seasonal businesses as well. And how do you make space for that? And I do believe that there is space for that. It's just, I think, working with employees one-on-one and finding out a model that works for them.
Cool. Albert, I'm going to, in a few minutes, shift to Rich and to Peter, because we're going to move on to some other sectors of the economy. But I wonder if you have any last thoughts on the discussion we've had in the last hour.
Well, I definitely feel that partnerships are beneficial. I definitely feel that when someone is not knowing where to go, to come to us, and we can definitely help out. In Wendy's case, it was very beneficial for her. She came prepared. She had the numbers. She had the return on investment. She had the business plan presented, and it was bam, 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 and it was like, wow. It was impressive, and I was happy to hear that there was a positive uptake on that presentation, and the project or the investment is moving forward. So, and where YFNCC can play a part is helping bridge industry across all sectors with First Nation Development Corps. And we do that through different means like the CEO Breakfast Before Hours.
And perhaps even reinforcing the link with the education sector too.
Yes,
which
exactly.
Seems to me your colleagues here are doing.
Yeah, and that's another thing that we've done is we've established a scholarship fund or bursary or however you want to call it with Yukon Foundation, because we feel that our youth are our future. Our youth is the leaders of tomorrow, and we want to encourage our youth to stay in school and develop a career of their choice.
Our youth is our past would not be a good slogan, would it?
Yeah.
Tony, could I just add?
I want you to come in now anyway. Come
Yeah,
in.
I wanted just because, pick up on something that Wendy and Yanni were talking about, and Albert's just mentioned in his comments, and that is, and it's also in the category of your question, what hasn't worked. We absolutely believe what Wendy and Yanni were referring to there, that you've got to reach early. You got to reach the kids early and interest them in these careers. And we know that our biggest challenge is middle and senior management ranks being filled with First Nations citizens. And we recognize that there's all kinds of problems we have because we haven't been able to make that happen. And so we've tried some things, and one thing we did try was to come up with a scholarship program. And we introduced a concept where we would identify early a student or a potential student who is interested in getting involved in the hospitality industry, and we would provide them with both the support financially to go to, whether it's something like a Royal Roads College to get a hospitality management degree, and then come back and work with us in the off season from school and get some practical experience. And we, of course, we sit around a table and we think this is just a wonderful idea. And we instituted this probably about 5 years ago, and I would say it's been highly unsuccessful. And we need some help. We're not doing something right. We haven't promoted it properly. We haven't identified the right people. I'm not sure what the issues are. I know probably part of it is in the design of the program, but it on paper, it looks like an exceptional way to go down this road, and yet we've been, I'm going to say, almost completely unsuccessful with it.
So I want to come back to that, not immediately now, but because in the interviews we've done on the review of Chapter 22, we've bumped into time and time again First Nations who are thinking about a destination hotel or a high-end facility to attract more affluent tourists, to be frank, which used to be the older demographic, something I'm becoming more acquainted with.
Me too.
But when you ask the secondary question about aspirations of the people in the community about working in that industry, they immediately went to chambermaid and waitressing jobs, which did not appeal to them, even if they had not yet got a post-secondary education or training skills. So there's a problem there of sort of understanding the full potential of the opportunities, but also it seems to me that if a destination hotel at Banff Springs on the edge of Quantico National Park, for example, represented for people not careers, but chambermaid or low-wage chambermaid and waitressing jobs, I don't have a problem understanding why the communities weren't rushing into that, which is a question, and I'm going to segue. Before you came into the conversation, Albert made a kind of interesting point, which I know NVD has addressed, which is this problem of his experience in the Chateau Mayo. I may be the only one here old enough to remember there used to be something called the Whitehorse Travel Lodge, and which I was sitting in the lobby one afternoon, having moved down from Dawson City after, before the winter actually, just at the end of summer, and the man behind the desk, who happened to be the manager of the chain hotel as it was then, who from Anchorage, said to Dick North, who I was talking to, "Do you know anybody who could actually fill in at the front desk? The afternoon guy hasn't turned up." And Dick turned to me and said, "What about you, Tony?" I said, "I've never worked in a hotel before." I said, "What does it pay?" $2 an hour. Okay, so I went and did 8 hours on the desk at $2. At midnight, the night guy didn't turn up. So my first day, I did a 16-hour day shift at $2 an hour. Not a career I actually really wanted, but it's an interesting thing that that opportunity was not seen as an opportunity. What you guys in MVD have been brilliant about, it seems to me, is understanding that by going in as minority shareholders in some operations, which might be owned by First Nation, but what you've done is you've bought management skills and therefore knowledge transfers and training potential into those businesses that wouldn't have existed otherwise.
Yeah, there's a lot to say on that, and I'll get to that in a second. But
Yeah.
just on the first point,
Yeah.
I don't think a person will look at a housekeeping job or a job as a server or whatever
Yeah.
as an entry level job to a career or an opportunity that's long term, unless they can see themselves in the positions that are higher up in the ladder. And I think that is our problem. We have a lot of people who will look at working for us as a transient opportunity, because when they come and they look, they either see an old white guy or they see somebody up the ladder that might be a position that they're after, that they can easily conclude, well, it seems like it's a non-starter for me. And we pride ourselves in the diversity of our workforce and our senior people and our team and so on. But even though we pride ourselves in that, we know we haven't done enough, and we know people don't see it that way. So we know constantly the challenge is to make sure that we've got people in those seats who represent the kind of people who we want to bring into the organization and keep with us long term. And that sort of finishes that point that I was making earlier, and it has been a big failure for us. In terms of just sort of wrapping up everything I heard as I came in here and answering your question, we've always looked at these joint ventures with development corporations, and it warms my heart to see Annie down there with an NVD cup in front of her.
It was not staged.
My only question is, why don't I have
And I heard you talking just a little bit earlier about, the nature of what was expected of development corps. And certainly when we come in and see these opportunities for partnerships, when we look at our development corp partners, we know that they're expected to be community-minded. We understand that. They all talk that language. We know they're also expected to make money. And they are criticized equally for not making money and not paying enough attention to their community responsibilities and so on. And so when we come in, we understand that they're under immense pressure to do both of those things at least. And we see it as an opportunity for us to come in, bring some skills, bring some understanding of systems, bring some synergies and some buying power and those kinds of things, and marry that up with people who know a lot more about their community than we do, and will always know a lot more about their community than we do, and we'll learn from them over time. But we can help them with the pressures that are on them to make sure that they meet a certain return hurdle, because we have a large number of shareholders who won't let us off the hook from making that return. So we have an obligation, but we also are 48% First Nation owned as a partnership overall. And so we have, at least in part, we have that same obligation to the communities. And whereas we may be seen, and I'm not sure this is always the case because there's some excellent performing development corporations out there, but we may be seen as having more consistently delivered on the financial return front. I think we're also seen as having less consistently delivered on the community engagement front. Many of our First Nations who've invested in us, I think, realistically expect us to do more in terms of employment opportunities, to do more in terms of our community engagement and so on. It's not for lack of trying, Tony. We certainly understand the obligation, but we don't have the same skill sets maybe that some of our development corporation partners have in really understanding what that looks and feels like, and so they can train us on that regard. And we've had some very successful partnerships that have been helpful that way, very educational for us to help drive down that road. I think there's a real coming together there when it works. There's a real coming together of skills and understanding that makes us both better.
I think it's not just understanding the obligation, because it's going back to Wendy's point. The fact of the matter at the Travel Lodge, despite my best efforts, I was within 3 months the night auditor and within 6 months the assistant manager. Mm-hmm. So it's understanding the opportunities too, and I think that's a real challenge for young people. I mean, in the days when Albert's highest ambition was to become the owner of the Chateau Mayo, it took a long time for him to get to the point where he realized that was even an opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And you, as I said, you could see yourself in those roles. There was no, you didn't see impediments for yourself in getting to that
No, but
place.
it wasn't where I wanted to go.
Yep.
It's just that there suddenly was an opportunity there. Which
Yes,
is,
of course.
Yeah.
If I may, I also think some of the points that Rich has been bringing up is really important for organizations to do, and it's admitting when you don't know something and reaching out to the partners, to the resources that you have, admitting where you are missing the mark. Because I think if entities keep getting stuck in the mentality of admitting fault means corporate risk, we're never going to move the needle. And so I'm happy that Rich is, I won't say admitting fault, but saying where, you know, NVD as an entity could be doing better. Because the minute you're able to verbalize that out loud and document it, you can start to figure out the steps to move forward. Yeah. And I think so often entities will say, nope, us doing business as status quo, we're doing it well, because there's such a fear that when you admit that you're not doing it well, it means you're exposed. Right. And I think in order for us to move our economy forward based in reconciliation, we're going to have these very difficult conversations. And entities across the board, development corporations included, we're going to have the conversations where we say, we're not doing well in this one certain respect. How can we do better? And work with those stakeholders at the table to do so.
Well, someone who, despite my wonderful experience with the Travelodge, does not understand the hotel business except as a client nowadays, I was for many years fascinated by the fact that Iqaluit, which is not a tourist destination in the way that Whitehorse is, had chain hotels there, as did Yellowknife, which is also not, I think, despite the Northern Lights travel, which many East Asian people seem to come there for, is not as attractive, or at least not in my eyes anyway, as attractive a destination as the Yukon. We now have this active discussion here about, well, maybe Whitehorse isn't an attraction anymore. West Tours and so forth doesn't want to come here anymore or whatever. Dawson City is the lively conversation we've had in the First Nation community in this exercise, the Chapter 22 review, is the idea that wilderness and Indigenous cultures are the attractions we have to build on now. I don't see a discussion, even with the city of Whitehorse, which should be a player in this discussion, being part of that discussion.
Yeah, well, I think that Yukon is still a very, very attractive destination overall, and it's nothing's changed about the many attractions that the Yukon has, the natural phenomenon, the wide open spaces, et cetera. It's hard to say. I mean, this last couple of years, Tony, has been dominated by COVID lockdowns and so on, and that had a major impact on accommodations industry and tourism industry in Yukon. But you know, currently, as our fortunes go, we're having our best year ever in 2022. So I think that the demand is still there, very much so, for the tourism product, and you know, in terms of chains here, they are a big benefit to those who choose to put brands on their hotels.
Okay.
So,
well, whether it's Trump Tower or whatever. It is.
yes.
Let me, since you have survived the COVID experience well with your First Nation Development Corporation partners. Maybe I could ask both you and Peter to come in on what was it that you did that made get you through that time and also prosper in that time.
Well, I'll start on that, Peter. I know Peter's fairly new to his position, but the simple answer is that didn't happen necessarily in partnership with our First Nations partners. The thing that saved us as an opera, well, with the exception of the Bedrock.
I think it was one of the best performing hotels in Canada during COVID.
With the exception of the Bedrock, which did benefit, but it benefited from the same things that our other hotels benefited from, and that was that the mining industry was still very active. And the mining industry and all the component parts of the mining industry, which continued to operate in an essential way during that period.
So synergies.
Backfilled the lack of tourists in these hotels. So that's, Yanni, what I was getting at when I say that was the big factor. But you know, the Yukon's a great community. The Yukon did come together during the COVID period, and businesses, First Nations, DevCorps, everybody did join hands and sort of, circle the wagons and looked out for each other. And in my mind, there's no question that took place and was a factor in making the impacts a lot less than they otherwise would have been.
Okay, so I'm going to give it an opportunity to see if Peter wants to come in here, despite his relative newness, but he's got a world of experience. So,
Yep.
But I want then to turn, if I can, Rich, to what going forward with you and your DevCorp partnerships in tourism and hotels and so forth. What's your vision of where we will go, but where we can or might go? Let me just see if Peter has anything to add at that point. Peter, do you want to join this part of the conversation?
Sure. Well, I think, Rich is kind of the king of the hotel business. There's no question about that.
King of the what?
Of the hotel business.
Oh, okay. King of the hotel business. We should get a bumper sticker for him like that, eh?
Well, something like that, or maybe a coffee mug. I think we've got kind of a nascent partnership evolving here where we're looking at some core businesses, and it really is something that has financial and social support, creating a legacy, looking at food and some other things. And it really comes in on top of what's been said before by Yanni and others, is finding ways to really partner and to leverage these, coming back to the first comments that were made earlier on between the two ladies about not only the financial, but also the social side of it, because if we were to do some really great things in food and several other industries, then people working in those businesses will see that there is not only a hope, but there is something really worthwhile and tangible that's coming back. When Rich and I were spending a day with our trust and the citizens, it came across that owning or having a participation in food was quintessential to everyone. So we looked at one opportunity, and we're trying to get the information, in fact, from the owners. I don't know if that'll happen, but Rick came back after that saying, well, there's actually a business here in Dawson that would be looking to do an exit or to do some kind of merger situation, which would probably be much better scope and scale. So I think really the element of our nascent partnership is to look at things that fundamentally will benefit the communities and give the two types of return and create a legacy. So that I'll hand it back to Rich there.
And it's a broad question that you started down the road on there. But I think maybe what I can do, Tony, is share our experience, both good and bad, on this, and
Right.
and it might be helpful. When we look at it into it on a simple basis, we see the organization that the First Nations have undertaken, for the most part, and we think it makes all kinds of sense. They've got trusts that are established for long-term stewardship of citizens' money. They've got First Nations government that looks after the needs of the community, and they've got a DevCorp that is focused on local investment and building the various aspects of business within the community. And we look at that and we say, this is unbelievable. It's the First Nations trusts, for sure, are the engine of investment growth in the community up here, and it's a significant advantage versus many other places that we might operate. The DevCorps are incredibly nimble and able to really understand their community and dedicated to the community and investment in the community. And so, as I said earlier, they're a natural partner where we can learn a lot from. And we look at that and we say, this is an awesome opportunity for investment. But we understand that. And I think that the people involved in the DevCorps understand what they're trying to accomplish, and the people who are managing the trusts understand what they're trying to accomplish, but it isn't completely understood. And so when Peter talks about us sitting with the Trondequetchin Trust, that's a great example of this. We go up there thinking, okay, we're meeting the mandate. NVD's delivering the percentage return that's expected that will grow the trust funds that are invested in us. We've partnered directly with the DevCorp and others in Dawson, for example, in a number of hotels. We haven't just done one. We've bought into one. We've improved it. We've moved. We've expanded our footprint working with them, and tried to engage locals and do all the things that we're talking about around here. And then we sit in a meeting that the trust organizes with the citizens. And their interests aren't necessarily those things that I was just talking about. Their interests might go to, okay, you guys now own a hotel through the trust and through the DevCorps and so on. You know, what are you doing about special rates and special access and special this and special that? And that's part of it. That's got to be one of the benefits that comes back from community ownership of these assets. But I would hope that the focus would be broader than that, and that the concerns would be a little broader overall, because I think that that's where the real honest-to-God opportunity lies. I don't think that the concern about the special rates and special access and all those kinds of things is misplaced at all. I think that there should be side benefits to ownership of these assets, but there should be, I think we would benefit from a broader view of what's possible here across the board, and I don't always see that. I see it in pockets, but I don't see it across the board.
So let me just challenge you a little bit.
Okay.
In the sense that I look at the reluctance of Cartcross Tagish or citizens or Champagne-Ajax citizens about leaping, jumping, rushing into a big hotel, destination hotel project. I look at the fact that some hotels in this town have become social housing. You look at the fact that, as you mentioned, the hotels actually were surviving because of a booming, maybe that's not the right word, mining industry.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at the downturn in the tourism sector during COVID. It makes me wonder if the hotel, even though they're thousands of years old, hotels as an idea, needs reinventing in some way.
Yeah.
Is that a stupid question?
No, you're right, and you know, Cartcross Tagish First Nation has been looking at the, you know, in some incarnation, that Four Mountains project for ages, and obviously there's lots of opportunities west of here for great destination resorts.
Yeah.
Hotels are not too difficult to operate and run in urban settings. A little more challenging in places where Yanni and I are partners in Mayo, where it's a little you know, a little more seasonal and a little less liquid, if you will. But the resort is a different thing entirely. And resort requires a significant amount of capital. It requires a real infrastructure around it to make sure that when people come and find their way there, that there are things for them to see and do. I think Cartcross...
People may be asking you to actually provide the infrastructure.
Invest in all the time. We're asked to do that, but I think that it's coming. It's absolutely coming in the Yukon. I think the next phase of hotel development in the Yukon. I mean, you look at this Takini Hot Springs and what they're trying to do up there, and the I can't remember what the spa is called up there, Eclipse Spa. It's just a fantastic project that they built. Very unfortunate with the fire they had, but that's visionary. And a lot of people, naysayers out there, saying these guys are out of their minds for building it and so on. But it's a great experience, and it has the potential. Now, that probably wouldn't be my first choice for building a resort hotel there, but that kind of amenity is an important part of the mix. And I think that the Yukon in the next decade is coming of age in this regard, and I think we're going to see. And I think that the kind of partnerships we're talking about here are exactly the kind of partnerships that are going to make that happen. We're certainly interested and committed to looking for the right opportunity. And I think that we've probably cut our teeth up here long enough now to actually, as Yanni said, we haven't cut our teeth long enough to say we know what we're doing, but I think we can say we think we know what we're doing, and at least feel a level of confidence at that level.
Let me go to Yanni next, and then Peter, and then the putative owner of the Chateau Mayo, if he has anything to add. Go ahead, Yanni, if you have anything. Do you want to get into this conversation on that?
I might give the floor to Peter.
Will you? Okay.
I feel like I've taken up a lot of space.
Oh, don't apologize for that. We have enough time for you. Well, after Peter, let me ask where you see, does Mayo have a place on the tourism map? Is there other such opportunities? You know, a few years ago, we had big discussions here about ecotourism.
Yep.
And there was a strong pushback about it. Didn't leave any jobs or money here. People bought some food and gas and then went in the bush. You know, that kind of. So can we come back to that? Peter, you have anything you want to add to the? I mean, Dawson City has been a tourism destination for, well, it was a tourism destination for a long time, but once Parks Canada started moving in and renovating buildings there, as somebody called it, Disneyfying the heritage with the colorful buildings and so forth. But the Palace Grand, I think, was a wonderful thing to have done, as has some of the other things there. But that's been a tourism destination for decades. Does it have the same prospects as it has before COVID? Let me ask you that question, Peter.
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, but when I look at Dawson and I look at, I think it was mentioned earlier today, and I look at the kind of the true heritage here, and you mentioned ecotourism and so on, you have, the Yukon has the blessing of this amazing, amazing landscape. And of course you have, in all these centers, you have First Nations culture that goes back essentially thousands of years. So if we are able to get past the snapshot time of the gold rush and actually bring this to fruition, I think we probably have a wider appeal. Rich was talking about resorts and the challenges of those and having to have the infrastructure. You know, building a Whistler is a very expensive proposition. It's a great return once it's there, but getting there is a very long roadmap. Dawson is unique because of the Klondike, but it's also unique because of its heritage and the lands around it. And certainly in Europe and various countries, you mentioned about the Northern Lights and East Asians. The Chinese and the Japanese really love the kind of concept of Northern Lights and the wilderness and so on, but they're also looking for, typically for higher end accommodations, and presently we produce. So if we're to capitalize on this, we're going to have to be able to meet the needs of the travelers we would like to attract. Because, you know, frankly, we don't have this right now. And I think Rick's comment about COVID is very true in the resurgence. But now if we want to capitalize on an enhanced and a wealthier market coming to us, we're going to have the facilities to make that happen.
Okay. Yanni, did you want to get into that conversation?
It's all right.
You're going to pass? Okay.
Pass right now.
Albert, with your Chateau Mayo experience, I mean, let me ask the question because it's a provocative question. Can Mayo become a tourist destination?
I think it can if the people want it to.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being with the NND Development Corp 20 years ago, or is it 30 years ago? I can't remember. 2000. The people of the day had said, no, we don't want to be a tourism destination. Mm-hmm. We may want just maybe 5,000 people coming through.
Yeah.
We want to keep our pristine experiences. We want to be able to use our rivers. We want to be able to use our trails, and we want to be able to hunt and fish and berry pick, and we want to be able to preserve our sacred sites. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to exploit it. Mm-hmm. We had renovated the Bennett House as an interpretive center. We had, through the Silver Trail Tourism Association, built the trails around 5 Mile Lake. 5 Mile is one of the better campgrounds in Yukon. It's got a warm lake. It's shallow. It's nice. It's peaceful. that is what people want. When the tourists come to Dawson, Dawsonites come to Mayo.
We also come for the lakes.
Yeah. There
Berger always used to argue, complain to me, what was wrong with Dawson is it doesn't have a lake.
yeah. Well, it does
It
now.
does now, yeah.
Yeah, my cousin and her family have built the lake.
Yeah.
But there are definitely sites to see in the Silver Trail region. There's the Keno Museum. There is the Mount Haldane hiking trails. There's the hiking trails at Mount Hinton. There's Mayo Lake. There's the Duncan Creek Road and Taylor's Gold Mine. There is fishing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of lakes. So there is the potential for tourism opportunities. I think it's up to the people to decide when they're ready to do that.
So let me pick up on that before Yanni comes in, because you mentioned berry picking.
Yeah.
If you spend any time in Sweden or Finland, you'll know that one of the activities of families in August there is to go pick berries as a family unit. It's not quite subsistence living, but they go and pick them in large quantities, take them to centralized delivery centers, and then they find themselves on grocery shelves the next day. Now, the distances are much smaller than ours, but there's a kind of industry around that. And in fact, families have a holiday in which they earn money by picking berries. You fly on Finnair SAS inside the country, and you will find the meal on the plane, or maybe a reindeer stew with some berry sauce, and then an ice cream, which has actually got a compote, which is actually made out of berries. So they're constantly integrating, this is the synergies of natural resources, renewable resources, and the tourism industry as a way of marketing, but also as a way of providing content to the tourism experience. And I'll just tell you one story. I was in a tiny Sami community in north central Sweden, Kiruna. And I was asked to look at a Sami operated tourism business, which was, and it's an advantage of only being 2 hours away from Frankfurt, but they were basically marketing to high performing auto executives from Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, all those auto companies. They were doing a reward program where the high-performing executives got to spend a weekend where they flew into Kiruna and then went to Jukkasjärvi. They would be taken by helicopter to the top of a mountain, sleep the night in a Sami traditional tent, hike, interesting enough, down the hill to a river the next day, go on a whitewater rafting experience. By the way, then they would eat caribou, or what they call reindeer, at night. Go on this whitewater rafting experience. At the end of the day, eat locally caught fish, get back on their 747 and fly back to Frankfurt. And I was very impressed with this operation because every weekend they had these guys coming in from Germany. So I said to the guy, the young Swedish guy who was running this operation, I said, "What's your markup on this stuff?" He said, 400%. And I said, "Well, where did you learn the tourism business? It's a tiny Sami community." And he smiled, big grin at me. He said, "I was a bush hippie in the Yukon for 2 years." I mean, he came to the Yukon, learned that. There's nothing like that going on here, but it actually sparked his imagination in a way that he was able to go back and create a highly successful business for an Indigenous community. And I thought there's something about innovators there, which is actually kind of interesting, because he made something out of nothing. That was, but all using what I would call local materials, people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And moving forward,
Yeah.
like all of Yukon has the potential. Rich and I had sat on the Yukon Tourism Strategy Committee, and that is not only for government, it is for every sector in Yukon to participate in the Yukon tourism. because there is the service supply sector, not only hotels or restaurants, but people who look after the roads, people who, the mom and pop shops along the way that provide the experiential experience, the grocery stores, the canoe rentals, the boat trips, as Valerie Royal said, the outhouses along the way, the tourism signs, which the signage people, like there is a lot of opportunity there, and it is there for the taking, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I know that we worked on the Yukon story, branding ourselves, Yukoners telling our story to outsiders. We may not be there yet, but that seed has been planted. When the time is right, it'll flourish, and we will be able to tell our stories. The Indigenous tourism sector is growing. With reconciliation, we're able to take our culture back. A lot of us have started our craft work, our beading, our sewing. We have
And the next one of our spotlights is actually going to be on that subject.
yeah, our cultural performances, sharing our stories, our traditional knowledge. That is part of Yukon. That is part of the experience.
So let me ask both you and Yanni the tough question. If a community doesn't want tourism, Mayo, somewhere else, is it worth asking why not?
I think it is. I think because it's the people that are there that have to live with the impact. Like
Well, perhaps not receiving any benefit.
possibly,
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
but it's changing. Like Joella has got her soap making factory there. That mindset is changing as younger generations are coming up. The opportunities arise.
Yeah.
And I would say it's perhaps not necessarily that the community doesn't want tourism, but it's tourism in what form. So when NND did the 2018 tourism plan with their citizens, that, the question was asked, like, is this a path we want to go down? And if so, in what form? And I think the sentiment still very much was wanting tourism, but not at such a high level that the community just has floods of people coming in.
So meaning not mass market tourism.
Correct. Yeah. And more, I'm going to say bespoke experiences, smaller scale, but with a lot of care behind it. So things like glamping opportunities came up. So glamorous camping for people that don't know what glamping is.
Carcross Tagish citizen described that to me as tents with chandeliers.
Yeah. Things came up around, like possibly wedding venues or areas. Oh.
We got bumped. We'll carry on talking anyway because we'll pick up if we can.
All right. I think like a sentiment that came up quite a bit was developing infrastructure that, let's say, can meet an industry target, but also has a community benefit. So I think of like the Bedrock, and we're going to be having our strategic planning sessions for the Bedrock. And the Bedrock has this beautiful upstairs space. And is a space where people have celebrated birthdays, people have gotten married, there have been celebrations of life. We just decided to drink and dance all night. Like, there's so much.
Shocking.
There's so much that has happened in that space.
Yep.
And it can be a revenue generator, or I'll say a revenue attractor, because I think that's also a concept we need to consider in tourism. So something that the space isn't necessarily earning a ton of revenue for you, but it's drawing people to your facility. And so how do we marry those two components? So how do you have the industry side, but also that community benefit? And I like the point that Albert brought up, just, all the different ways in which you can participate in tourism. And so like Joella, she has her facility there in Mayo, and let's say like soaps in the hotels, the experience of getting to go down to her plant and be a part of that. We're currently working on hopefully building a makerspace in the community. So an underutilized building that we've had, which has been the cafe. So how do we meet different goals and objectives with that space? So in the downstairs, we would have the garment making studio. Upstairs, we'd have an opportunity to have, let's say, like artists in residence, so to speak. There's the food innovation lab that would have production plus consumption. And all of that has some avenue to tourism as well, because it's putting local artisans and makers on the map, but doing it in a way in which we can break down the barriers in terms of access to infrastructure and access to capital.
Right. And I love the fact that she actually took pride in the fact that her building was built by a First Nation construction company from Dawson City. So, that's the kind of synergies we should get. Let me just say now, unless Rich or Albert have anything to add on tourism, I want to switch to the bigger subject of land, if I can. Go ahead, Rich.
No, I'm good on tourism. I'm happy to shift to land.
It does seem to me that it's good that there's tourism planning and tourism thinking, but I'm struck by, as someone who lives in Whitehorse, how much Carcross is as a destination for day trippers from Whitehorse. Anybody comes to visit us, family, relatives, business, one of the things that everybody seems to do is take them down to see Carcross. Not that there's huge facilities there, but even that little tourism enclave with the little things is such a lovely attraction that and the cultural center is even another one, as is the First Nation Cultural Center here.
Tony, there probably is one thing that needs to be mentioned in tourism, and this is again a broader topic, but there's a real opportunity, and we talked earlier about how investment the investment style has grown over the course of time as the DevCorps and the trusts have become more mature and so on, and there's been a coming together in opportunities here. A big opportunity in front of us right now for Yukon tourism is, of course, the idea of a serious, for a capital city like Whitehorse, a serious convention center. And one of the things that will build tourism in the Yukon and continue to add the infrastructure that's necessary is to have a well-conceived convention center that will really be appropriate to this type of a place. And that will bring together, if it's done properly, the federal government, the territorial government, the Whitehorse city government, the First Nations, and the private sector.
And to Yanni's point, I think earlier point, that what would make that a success is genuinely a multi-purpose facility.
I think if you're looking at it strictly from a tourism perspective, the most important aspect is that it be downtown. Right. But if you're looking at it from a community perspective, you then might wish it to be many other things as well. And of course, as soon as you start to talk about these things, it becomes there's a lot of stakeholders. So it'll be weaving through all of that and making sure it can do what it should do for the tourism industry is going to be very critical.
Yeah. I mean, someone recently commented to me about what a pity it was that the Yukon University didn't seem to be a partner in economic planning for the city. Many cities, build their attractions. Queen's University, for one, has this big convention center, which is a profitable facility for the university.
Yeah.
So let me switch to, and I'm going to go very much to Rich now, if I may, since he used the word capital and the word land. And land, First Nation lands, as a result of land claims, have been a really key element in capital formation for not just First Nations, but for the territory. Could you just reflect, if I might ask you, Rich, on the experience of investing in and utilizing First Nation lands, but also what a central fact they are now in the emerging Yukon economy, an economy which, in fact, First Citizens are engaged as well as the traditional.
Sure. Well, land development, I mean, it's so important, obviously, in many respects. It's a very important aspect of how communities grow, and that's obviously our main area of investment is in land development and operating commercial and residential property assets and so forth. I think if I were just reflecting generally, I think that there has been a real opportunity to do a better job architecturally, which of course we've tried to focus on as we've gotten involved in this community. I think the First Nations themselves have been working a lot on what they do with the lands that they own in different categories and how they make those assets productive and continue to retain the ownership of them and so on. And I think that we're seeing some interesting things being done with land leases and so on. That's I think that as more and more of that happens, I think the First Nations in general will play a much bigger role going forward in what happens here in respect to developing up those lands. And the Kwanlin Dun project over to the north of us here is a great example of that. I think that land is, in one sense, Tony, land's easy because it's one of the easier investments to get involved in. It has value. It's got a well-defined value. There's a market for it. You build buildings. They have a long life. They aren't human resource dependent, so they're easy to. It's an easy investment to make, and for people who are trying to preserve capital and build wealth for their citizens long term, obviously owning the land assets and the building assets has got to be a critical component of any First Nation portfolio because of the nature of that. Hotels are a great example of something that kind of bridges from that and allows them to both have that land value, building value, and also have a human resource engagement. So it's kind of a hybrid, but land in and of itself probably plays a pretty important role in long-term asset portfolios for the First Nations up here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll come to you in a second, if I may, Yanni, and if you want to get into that conversation.
Sure.
The land obviously has value, profoundly important value for First Citizens beyond just money.
Sure.
But top of mind, what kind of dollar value might we impute in 2022 to the 41,000 square kilometers of land that First Nations settled in the land claim back in the late 80s and early 90s?
Yeah, well,
It would be pretty significant now, wouldn't it?
It would. I wouldn't hazard a guess on that, Tony, because there's such a diversity of that land base. But I'll say this: land has done nothing but go. Even though there's lots of it up here, land has simply continued to increase in value consistently since we've been involved in the Yukon in the early 2000s. Even though there's lots of it, it certainly has a significant asset value.
Mm-hmm. And places like Carcross-Tagish are doing some deep thinking about what governing land and land management means, and there are no doubt Indigenous people who worry about the commodification of land. But, Yanni, do you have anything you would like thoughts you might express?
On the land piece
Yeah.
specifically,
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about the value in economic terms, especially since land use planning hasn't been completed across the territory. And I think that has to be a precursor.
Well, it's also a requirement of Chapter 22.
Yes.
That has to be done. Yeah.
And I think also, I don't have to get into it, but how we approach land use planning and what does that process look like, because that will greatly determine what the outcomes are.
Okay.
Right. So is it land use planning that's happening from an Indigenous worldview and lens, or is it land use planning that's happening from the lens of ticking a box? And I hope it's the former, not the latter. But, there are so many different considerations that land use planning will take in, and I think only once that's done will we start to get a fuller picture of what are all the opportunities, and what are all the realities that we can work towards. And I'm kind of happy that it got brought up in this kind of conversation, because I feel often land use planning is spoken about zoning or mining.
Yeah.
It's very much geared towards resource development type conversations. And we all use the land in many different ways, and we need to consider what all those different components are.
So since you're an expert in this field, and you have just in passing made a critique of the land use planning that is going on, let me ask you, because this is useful, how ought we to be doing land use planning, and how, if we were doing it properly, might it truly reflect the partnership with First Nations and not simply seeing it as an opportunity to monetize?
I don't think I have the answer for that.
So what are the questions you would ask in trying to answer them?
Well, one, who was at the table in designing the process?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say having intention setting meetings, but I think oftentimes approach to land use planning or community planning or whatever it may be is that the plan is the tangible outcome and the end goal. And it's not considered a living document or an ongoing relationship. Okay. Just because you finished a land use plan does not mean that it doesn't have to be consistently updated and things like that. So I think trying to find a way in which we can design the process so that it is constantly living and breathing and adapting with communities and with people and with nations, I think is key.
So let me ask you a question. Mm-hmm. Chapter 22 question. One of the central recommendations of Chapter 22 was there should be a Council on the Economy and the Environment.
Yeah, where did that go?
I don't have an answer to that question, though I do. Well,
sorry.
That proposed that business community, the chambers of commerce, including the chambers of mines, would have 1/4 of the seats on a 12-person body. Mm-hmm. That First Nations would have 1/4 of the seats. Working people through their unions would have 1/4, and as would the environmental organizations. And that was deliberately intended following the great Norwegian idea of sustainability, mm-hmm. Of balancing economic and environment, that we would have not as a regulatory body, not as a decision-making body, but as an opportunity, a citizens' assembly, to try and create a consensus on some of the big questions about economic planning, which that was supposed to play a role in, mm-hmm. regional economic planning, periodic reviews of implementation, none of which has happened 30 years after the fact. Is the Council on the Economy and the Environment a potential instrument for having a kind of discussion about land use planning in future from your point of view? I used the word potential, didn't they?
I think it could be a potential avenue or body, but perhaps not the only body.
Oh,
right.
I'm not
that one would be, I'd say, larger in scope.
Macro. Yeah.
Yes, very much macro. And that land use planning, it starts with the community first. And a body that is that macro will never be able to represent the views or even hear all the views of communities.
But it might be able to settle on some values.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or perhaps some intentions. I mean, a lot of times we talk about the spirit and intent and
Right.
right. And each of these.
The spirit of that, I think, was to actually bring the people together to talk, and the intention was to try and achieve consensus.
Yes. So I do think it could be a potential body.
Yeah.
But the caveat being not the only body.
So let me just ask you, focus a little bit. If you're looking just at Mayo, you have world famous hotels like the Chateau Mayo and the other property which we've discussed. You don't have a large economy, but you do have lots of mining activity. You have very significant First Nation communities, we would argue, because the Northern Shoshone neighbors are probably part of that world. how would you proceed with land use planning in just that area? I'm not saying as if you were a boss, but how would you begin to who would you bring to the table, to answer your question, who would you bring to the table, and how would you craft the agenda?
Oh, Tony, you're really putting me on the spot.
Well, that's why you're here, your brilliance and your Harvard professorship and your...
I really think that comes from it starts with the community and
Yeah.
consensus from the community on who they want to bring to the table.
Okay.
And NND and other nations are working through that process. But yeah, it has to be in the vision of the people that live and use those spaces. So I don't have the answer on who I would bring to the table, but I definitely have the answer on who I would go to determine who should be at the table.
Well, let me ask you and Albert, because you both have experience in this area. There's been silver mining going on there for the best part of 100 years. Would silver miners be welcome at the table?
You guys are getting me on record right now. I would say potentially not at the first stages, in the earlier stages, and not because their views or opinions aren't valid or something to be considered, but I think when you have these large economic drivers that have been there for so long, in which it kind of makes it the status quo, it's so hard to not have those conversations drive the process.
Okay. So let me ask you, what about the tourism industry? And I'm going to ask Albert to respond to this too. What about the tourism industry, and who would represent them if they were invited?
Well, I feel on the Mayo level, we do have the Silver Trail Chamber of Commerce and Tourism Association, and that entity, thanks to I think Ann Leckie's charge mostly, was able to sign MOUs between the chamber and the nation. And I don't know how many of the other local chambers or even the chambers here in Whitehorse have those types of relationships with the nation, and also including so many other stakeholders. So the bylaws were written in a way in which all of those stakeholders have a seat at the table in those conversations. So I think on that local level, to use one body as an example, that community chamber has done a lot to try to get representation at a more centralized table. Now, there are so many that aren't at that table, and we have identified as the executive for that chamber that more needs to be done. There needs to be more NND representation. There needs to be more youth representation, more entrepreneur representation that operates in certain sectors, right? Because we are finding that it's very either accommodations focused or mining focused, and there isn't much representation from others that are either participating directly in tourism or adjacent to tourism.
I'm going to go to Albert, but one thing I discovered in the 1980s when you're doing these kind of consultative process, you can tell it's working if groups that weren't originally invited start demanding to be included. And it gets bigger and bigger. Well, that's actually a good thing. Albert.
So, participation in the land use planning. Well, you need to keep. Well, I'm only going to talk about the Mayo area. Definitely the First Nation and municipal government. You need to talk to the residents. Now, who represents them, I don't know, but there are a number of NGOs like the Mayo Renewable Resource Council, the I can't think of the name, the Peel Watershed Committee. Is that still going on?
I'm not too sure, actually.
So there are different NGOs. Maybe not specific mining companies because they come and they go. But maybe the mining sector, a representative from the mining sector, maybe a representative from the tourism sector. a representative from the business sector because there are a number of small businesses within Mayo, and they have invested there. They need to be represented. I think how do I say this? We all know about the decline in salmon. Back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a Mayo Salmon Enhancement Committee through the Renewable Resource Council. So someone that represents the fisheries, because we all have a part to play in finding solutions to rectify and restore the salmon population. That land planning has a role there.
Right. So that's good. That's good.
The Wildlife Management Board.
And I think also the voices that are no longer around.
Yeah, the recordings of elders.
Yeah, so I mean, earlier in the conversation, I brought up the work that Seidi's been doing, and you know, that's, I mean, she can correct me, but I think like 30, 40 years worth of documentation. It's recordings, it's written documentation, and there are just so many people that aren't around anymore, and their voices are just as valid and
it's
just
not
as pertinent to
it's
today.
not just elders. We've been looking at some research, excellent research done by Yukon researchers back in the 70s and 80s, which I'm not sure was ever read once it was done,
Yeah.
which is a problem.
Yeah, an example of what Yanni just said is Xing Xing. At MacArthur, what was known as MacArthur Hot Springs, now known as Thou Grow, there is particular protocols about using the hot springs there. You don't pick the flowers. You don't touch anything. You use the area. So those recordings or the stories that long gone elders have said, that has to be incorporated in that.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to give Rich a chance for the last word, if I may. What I want you to do, I'm going to ask you a very direct question. What is the Yukon doing right in terms of economic development or economic planning, and what is it doing wrong?
Okay, right and wrong.
Top of mind. Yeah.
Yeah. I think all of what we've been talking about, Tony, through these sessions and so on, I think there's a general recognition of the strength of partnership. And I think that if I had to pick one thing that it's doing right, it's trying its best to continue to support the evolution of partnerships. And I think that that's going to be at the heart of any long-term solution that really works and that takes advantage of this unique situation up here. I think that looking to support and enhance those partnerships is probably the single most important thing that can be done, and let people be creative within that framework. What is being done wrong? By who, I guess, would be my question.
Yeah.
Because we're all making all kinds of mistakes. I don't have one top of mind thing that I would say is wrong. There's, when pioneering enthusiasm is at its peak, lots happens, but it's both good and bad. And when regulation is at its peak, little happens, and that's both good and bad. And so trying to strike a balance between careful planning and regulation and not totally dampening entrepreneurial spirit and creativity. I think that there's a risk these days that we get over-regulated and we get over-planned. And I think that if there's one thing that maybe holds us back more than we'd like, it's probably in that area. But I don't, when I say that, I'm not thinking that we're incredibly good or incredibly bad. I think there's lots of opportunity here. I think that at the core of it is strong partnerships, and I think that those are evolving. That's what I would say.
Well, I want to say this has been a rich conversation. I want to thank Yanni and, I would say Albert, Rich. And Peter, is Peter still with us? I
Yeah.
can't
Yep.
see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Peter, and of course, Wendy, and I guess briefly, Peter was with us. And to thank the Gunta staff, Jesse, Blair, others. This has been a good conversation, but although we haven't, I think, reached the perfect solution on anything, we have had some profound observations by all of you. Thank you.
Thanks you. Thanks to you.
Thank you.